Hey, son, picture a Tuesday morning in 1953. You are pushing through the glass door of a diner on the corner of Main Street, and before the door even swings shut behind you, the smell of bacon grease and fresh coffee reaches you like something alive. The counter is full. Someone is laughing. A plate comes down on the linoleum with a clean, satisfying sound. If that image does something to you, you are in the right place. Go ahead and hit like, subscribe if you are new, and drop a comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from. I read every single one. Now, have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to sit down at an American diner in the 1950s? Not just what was on the menu, but the whole thing. The weight of the coffee cup in your hand, the particular creak of the stool, what the waitress said when she set your plate down, whether the pie tasted different then, because it probably did, what the other people at the counter were doing, what they were thinking, whether they were in any kind of hurry at all. Have you ever wondered what it felt like to eat a meal with no phone in your pocket, no noise in your ear, just the sounds of a room going about its morning? What made a diner feel like a diner and not just a place to eat? It is 1955 now. The coffee is already brewed. There is a stool with your name on it. Somebody at the end of the counter just pushed their empty plate forward and asked for one more cup. Settle in. Everything is about to make sense. Let's start before you even take a seat. You are still on the sidewalk, still 3 steps from the door, and already the diner has found you. Bacon fat on a flat griddle. Coffee that has been warming in the pot since 5 in the morning. Something sweet from the pie case near the register. In a 1955 diner, the smell reached out into the street and pulled you in by the nose. There is a specific vocabulary of smell that belongs to a 1950s diner and to nothing else. It is not one thing. It is a layering, a composition that built up over years of daily cooking until it lived inside the walls and the ceiling tiles and the fabric of the aprons hanging on the hook by the back door. Bacon was the top note. Always bacon, because someone had been cooking it since before the sun came up and the griddle had not cooled since. Under that was coffee, not the bright, acidic smell of fresh ground coffee from a ceramic pour-over, but something deeper and darker. The smell of coffee that had been brewed in large quantities and kept warm for hours, which is a different smell entirely, earthier, more patient. Then there was grease. Not the heavy, unpleasant grease smell of something gone wrong, but working grease. The smell of a flat griddle, doing what it was built to do. A smell that told you food was being made right now. Not 40 minutes ago in a commissary kitchen somewhere, but here, 6 feet in front of you, by a man who had been at it since dawn. Mixed into all of this was something sweet. The pie case near the register held whatever had been baked that morning, and in the warmth of the room, the sugar and the fruit or the chocolate made itself known. Not overpowering, just present, the way a good thing announces itself without demanding attention. What that combination did was something that no menu description and no food photograph has ever been able to replicate. It told you, before you made any decision at all, that this was a place where you were going to be fed. Not served, not presented with a dining experience. Fed. There is a difference, and the body knows it before the mind can name it. Modern restaurants are cleaner. The ventilation systems pull the cooking smells out of the dining room and up through the roof and away. The tables smell a cleaning solution. The air is neutral and climate-controlled. That is an improvement by almost any measurable standard. Healthier, certainly. More comfortable in certain ways. But the neutrality costs something. When you walk into a modern diner, even a good one, The room does not reach out to you. You reach into it cautiously, reading the menu, scanning the space, deciding whether you want to stay. The old diner made that decision for you in about 3 seconds, and it made it with smell, which is the most honest sense, the one least susceptible to being managed or curated or designed. There is research now that confirms what people in 1955 simply lived. Smell is the sense most directly connected to memory and emotion. It bypasses the thinking parts of the brain and goes somewhere older and more immediate. Which is why, if you sat at a diner counter in that era and someone today cooks bacon in a small kitchen on a Sunday morning, you are not merely reminded of the diner. You are briefly returned to it. The stool is under you. The cup is in your hand. The room is full. That is what a smell can do when it is the right smell in the right configuration. That diner had it from the first step on the sidewalk, before the bell above the door ever rang. You push the door open, and a small bell rings above your head. That bell is doing more work than it looks like. It tells the cook someone just walked in. It tells the waitress to glance up from whatever she is doing. It tells every person at the counter, without anyone saying a word, that the room just changed by one. Modern restaurants have hostess stands and waiting areas and ambient music designed to absorb your arrival without making anything of it. In a 1950s diner, you were noticed the moment you walked through the door. Not in a way that felt like surveillance, in a way that felt like welcome. The bell was small, usually a simple brass fitting mounted to the doorframe, and it had a particular tone, not the electronic chime of a modern shop, but a mechanical ring, short and clean, the sound of metal on metal. It rang when the door opened, and again, softer, when the door swung back and latched. 2 notes. One to announce you, one to confirm you had arrived. If you had been coming to the same diner for years, which a lot of people had, you knew the exact sound of that bell the way you knew the sound of your own back door. It was part of the texture of the place, as specific as the smell and the light. The first 3 seconds after that bell rang were their own small choreography. The waitress, wherever she was in the room, would glance toward the door. Not stop what she was doing, just glance. Long enough to note whether you were a regular or a new face, whether you were alone or with someone, whether you looked like a coffee and quick breakfast or a man who had time and was going to want the full plate. She was reading you in those 3 seconds, filing information she would use before she ever said a word. By the time she reached you, the water glass already in her hand, she had already made several decisions on your behalf. That efficiency was a skill. It took years to build, and it was built through repetition, through hundreds of mornings and lunches and afternoons, until people became readable in the same way the griddle was readable, by sound and heat and instinct. The cook heard the bell too. Even with his back turned, even with the griddle going and the hood fan running, he heard it. It did not change what he was doing, but it registered. He knew how many people were at the counter, not by counting, but by feel, the way a person knows the size of a room they have been in long enough. This is worth comparing to what happens now. You walk into a modern restaurant and a host says welcome and asks how many and checks a screen. The process is organized and efficient and nobody would argue with it. But it is a process. It has steps. The 1950s diner had something closer to a reflex. Your arrival caused a response the way dropping a stone in still water causes rings. Not managed, not coordinated, just immediate and real. And there was something in being noticed without being made a fuss of. The bell rang and eyes moved, and then the room continued exactly as it had been, and you found your stool and sat down. The noticing was quiet. The welcome was in the water glass that arrived in front of you within 30 seconds, without ceremony, without a speech about specials, without anyone asking your name. Just water. Just the quiet assumption that you were a person who had walked in from somewhere and needed to be taken care of. The bell started all of that. A small brass fitting on a door frame and everything that followed from it. It is the counter you remember even now, even decades later. Long and low, running the full length of the room, usually laminate over wood or poured concrete, worn smooth in places where 10,000 elbows had rested before yours. The countertop in a 1950s diner was not decorative. It was functional and honest. The kind of surface that showed its use without apology. You could set your coffee cup down hard and it would not flinch. Somewhere between a workbench and a dining table, the counter was its own category of furniture, one that has never quite been replicated in any modern setting, not even in the places that try. The material varied by diner and by decade, but most counters in the 1950s were surfaced in laminate, the same material you saw on kitchen tables in the post-war American home. Colors that seem vivid now because they have become associated with the era. Mint green, pale yellow, a kind of off-white that aged into cream. The edges were usually finished with a strip of chrome, a thin band of metal that ran the full length of the counter and caught the light in a way that gave the room a modest brightness. The chrome was polished every morning. It was one of the first things the counter girl did when she came in, wiping it down with a cloth until it reflected the overhead, lights in a clean, narrow stripe. Behind the counter was the workspace. And unlike the dining room side, which was wiped clean and orderly, the cook's side of the counter was a working surface, active and organized in ways that only made sense from inside. The flat griddle ran hot all day. Spatulas and ladles hung or lay within reach. Tickets were clipped to a small rail above the window. Plates were stacked. Cups were inverted on a mat beside the coffee station. Everything had its place because the pace of the work required it. A short-order cook in a 1950s diner could not afford to look for things. The workspace had to be readable by hand, by reaching without looking. The counter created a particular kind of proximity between the person being served and the person doing the serving. You were close enough to watch the cook work if you wanted to, close enough to hold a conversation with the waitress without raising your voice. That closeness was not intimate in any uncomfortable way. It was simply present. You were inside the operation rather than at a remove from it. In a modern restaurant, the kitchen is behind a wall or tucked behind a partition. What happens back there is not your business. At the diner counter, it happened in front of you, a few feet away, and it was completely ordinary. There is something about a long counter that changes how a room feels. Tables divide a room into private units, each one a small territory. The counter unified the room. Everyone along it shared the same view, the same focal point, the same cook, the same coffee station, the same small theater of the griddle. You were not isolated in your meal. You were part of a row, a shared experience, even with strangers, even if no one spoke. The physical arrangement made solitude comfortable and company easy, which is a balance very few spaces manage to strike. Run your hand along that counter in your memory if you can reach it. The laminate is cool and smooth, except where it is worn. The chrome edge catches your thumbnail if you drag it sideways. The stool swivels a quarter turn when you shift your weight. The surface in front of you is clean and waiting, and somewhere behind it, A man in a white apron is already moving. The stools were bolted to the floor. That is the first thing. They were not pulled out and tucked in. They were permanent, fixed, as much a part of the room as the walls. They swiveled, usually, and the swivel had a particular resistance to it, a slight drag that made spinning feel satisfying in a way that was hard to explain. Children spun them constantly. Adults pretended they did not want to. The stool meant something about how the counter worked. You were not arranged around a table facing each other, performing conversation. You were all pointed the same direction, at the counter and the cook, shoulder to shoulder, like passengers going somewhere together. The construction of a diner stool was deceptively simple. A round, padded seat, usually vinyl in red or green, mounted on a chrome post that was bolted through the floor. No back, no arms, just the seat and the post, and the swivel mechanism underneath. Some stools had a footrest ring that ran around the post at ankle height, and that ring was worn bright and smooth where 1,000 pairs of shoes had rested against it. The footrest was where you hooked your heel when you settled in. It was a small comfort, the kind you did not notice until it was not there. The vinyl of the seat had a particular feel, slightly cool when you first sat down, then warming to you, smooth in the middle, cracked at the edges in older diners where the sun came through the window at a certain angle every afternoon for years. You could feel the seams where the vinyl had been repaired or replaced. Some stools had small tiers that had been reinforced with a strip of matching tape that never quite matched. None of this bothered anyone. The stool was a working object, not a design object, and it looked like one. There were unspoken rules about the stools that nobody had to teach you, because the room taught them. You did not take a stool that had a coat draped over it. You did not spread your things across 2 seats when the counter was getting full. You did not spin endlessly if you were old enough to know better. You left a stool between yourself and a stranger if there were open stools available. And when the counter filled up, the convention dissolved naturally and without comment. These were not posted rules. They were just the way people navigated shared space before shared space required management. Children were a different matter. A child at a diner counter in the 1950s was in a state close to joy. The stool spun. That was really the whole of it. You sat down and you discovered immediately that the seat moved, that you could turn yourself in a slow circle and watch the room rotate past you. The pie case, and the register, and the door, and the booths, and back to the cook. Your mother told you to stop. You stopped. You started again 30 seconds later. The cook sometimes made a comment, not unkind, just noting the spinning with a raised eyebrow or a small shake of the head. And that attention from an adult you did not know was its own small thrill. Sitting at a counter stool without a back requires a certain posture. You sit up, not stiffly, not formally, but upright, because there is nothing to lean against, and slouching feels wrong after a minute. That upright posture may have been part of why the counter felt like a different experience from a booth. You were not settled in. You were present, alert in a mild way, engaged with the room, aware of who was next to you. The stool did not let you disappear into yourself the way a booth could. It kept you in the room. And for 20 minutes at noon on a Tuesday, being kept in the room was exactly what you needed. Nobody seated you at a diner. That is worth pausing on. You walked in, you found an open stool, you sat down. Within a few seconds, someone had set a glass of water in front of you. Not asked if you wanted water. Decided that you did, because of course you did, and brought it. The greeting at a 1950s diner counter was efficient and genuinely warm at the same time, which is a combination that is harder to pull off than it sounds. Modern restaurant greetings are often scripted. They come with names, with upsells, with carefully worded check-ins. The diner greeting came with water, a menu, and the quiet assumption that you were a person who deserved to be taken care of. The water arrived in a plain glass, not a stemmed goblet, not a mason jar, not a vessel with any particular design ambition. A glass, thick at the base, slightly tapered, the kind manufactured by the millions for institutional use. Cold water, sometimes with ice, often without, depending on the season and the diner. It arrived within seconds of you sitting down, set in front of you with a small decisive tap, and its arrival meant something specific. It meant you had been acknowledged. It meant the transaction of the meal had begun. Nobody had said welcome. Nobody had given you their name. Nobody had made any promise about the quality of the experience you were about to have. They had simply brought you water, and in doing so, said everything that needed to be said. You are here. We see you. We will take care of you now. The menu followed shortly after. A laminated card or a small folder, set down with the water or presented a moment later. The waitress might say, "What would you like?" or she might just stand with her pad open, pencil ready, giving you the space to read and decide without hovering. She had done this enough times to know the difference between someone who had been coming in for 15 years and already knew what they wanted and someone who was new and needed 30 seconds with the card. She could tell from the way you sat down, from whether you reached for the menu before it was offered. If you were a regular, the greeting was different in a way that mattered enormously. She might set your coffee in front of you before you asked, because she already knew. She might say the usual, with the pencil raised, and you would nod, and that would be the whole of it. 2 words. But those 2 words contained something. They contained the fact that you had been here before, that you had been noted, that your preferences had been held in someone's memory and brought out for you without your having to explain yourself. In a world that asks you constantly to re-enter your information, to restate your preferences, to start from the beginning every time, the diner that remembered your order was giving you something genuinely rare. And if you were new, if you had never been in before, you were not made to feel it. There was no ceremony around regulars that excluded strangers. You sat down and you got the same water and the same menu and the same pencil hovering over the same pad. The warmth was not reserved. It was available to whoever walked through the door, which was the whole point of a place that existed on the premise that everyone who needed to eat deserved to be fed. That is the thing about the diner greeting that is genuinely difficult to manufacture. It was not a performance of hospitality. It was just hospitality, built into the operation the way the griddle was built into the operation. Because without it, the whole thing did not work. The menu was 1 page. Sometimes it was laminated. Sometimes it was written on a chalkboard above the grill. Either way, it was short enough to read in 30 seconds and familiar enough that you probably already knew what you wanted before you picked it up. Grilled cheese, tomato soup, a hot beef sandwich, eggs any way, pie, coffee. The brevity was not a limitation, it was a promise. Everything on that menu was something the cook had made 1,000 times. There was no risk of a bad dish because there was no dish that had not been practiced into something close to perfect. The modern menu is a document. The diner menu was a handshake. The laminated menu was a practical object that had been handled by thousands of hands before yours. The edges were soft with use. The surface showed small scratches in the laminate, tiny hairline marks that caught the light if you tilted the card. The text was typed or sometimes printed in a bold, blocky font. Nothing designed, just clear. Prices appeared beside each item in a column on the right. Everything was organized not by concept or narrative, but by meal. Breakfast items, lunch items, sandwiches, soaps, desserts, beverages. The categories were honest and functional. They told you where to look without making it an experience to navigate. The brevity of that menu was a philosophical statement, though nobody at the counter would have used that language. It said that what we do here, we do well. It said that the goal is not to overwhelm you with options. It said that choice is a courtesy up to a point, and beyond that point, it becomes a burden. A modern restaurant menu can run to 6 pages. It can include dietary annotations and origin stories for the ingredients, and descriptions written in a language that treats every dish as a small act of culinary creation. There is a kind of hospitality in that, a want to give you everything. But the diner menu understood something that the long menu does not always acknowledge, that what most people want, most of the time, is to make a simple decision and trust that it was the right one. The chalkboard menu was even simpler and in some ways more honest. The cook had written it that morning in his own hand. What was up there was what he had, what was fresh, what he knew he could make well that day. If the soup was chicken noodle, it was chicken noodle because he had made it this morning. If the special was meat loaf, it was because he had the ingredients and the time, and it was what made sense today. The chalkboard menu was a daily conversation with the customer. A small report from the kitchen. Here is what we are doing today. Come sit down. Ordering from a short menu had a particular feeling that is worth naming. You read it, you decided, and then the decision was settled. There was no lingering uncertainty, no sense that you might have made a better choice 2 lines down. The menu did not offer enough options to produce regret. You got the grilled cheese or you got the tomato soup, and you did not spend the meal wondering about the other thing, because the other thing was 3 items away and not mysterious. The food arrived, and it was what you expected, and the expectation had been precisely met, which is its own form of satisfaction, quieter than surprise, but more reliable. The menu was a promise, and the diner kept it every day, for every person who came through the door. That kind of reliability is not glamorous. It does not attract attention or generate enthusiasm the way novelty does. But it builds something slow and solid over time, the kind of trust that made people come back every Tuesday for 20 years and never once doubt that the grilled cheese would be right. He was usually a man in a white apron, and he worked without looking up. Short order cooking in a 1950s diner was a physical skill, the kind built through repetition until the body knew what to do before the mind had to ask. He managed the griddle the way a musician manages an instrument, not thinking about individual notes, just playing. He flipped things at exactly the right moment. He knew by the sound of the sizzle whether the heat was right. He almost never explained what he was doing or made it a performance. The food appeared. That was all that needed to happen. Modern open kitchen restaurants have turned the cook into a spectacle. In the diner, he was simply a man doing his work, and the doing of it was its own dignity. He arrived before anyone else, before the waitress, before the first customer, before the lights in the dining room were switched on. The prep work was his. He made the soup. He sliced the meat. He portioned the pie, filling into the crusts, and put them in the oven. He checked the level of the coffee supplies and confirmed that the griddle was heating evenly. By the time the first customer came through the door, he had been working for 1 or 2 hours, and the room was ready because of it. That invisible labor was the foundation of everything the counter offered. You sat down and the food came quickly because someone had been standing at a prep table since before dawn making sure it could. The short order cook in a 1950s diner occupied a specific physical space for the entire workday. He stood between the griddle and the window, the small pass-through where plates went out to the counter. Everything he needed was within reach, arranged so that no movement was wasted. He did not pace or move around. He worked in place, turning from the griddle to the cutting board to the window, a choreography of small movements executed hundreds of times a day until they had the quality of something natural and inevitable. He communicated in shorthand. An order called back from the counter in the compressed language of the kitchen. 2 over easy, corner, BLT down, hold the mayo. He responded without words or with one syllable of acknowledgement. The orders came in and the plates went out, and the rhythm of this was maintained across a full breakfast rush or a packed lunch counter without visible stress or disruption. That steadiness was part of the skill. Not just cooking quickly, but maintaining the pace for hours, absorbing the variation of orders and the unpredictability of the rush without letting it show in the food. If you sat at the counter long enough, you watched him. Not obviously, not staring, but the way you watch something that is happening close to you and is interesting without being dramatic. The motion of the spatula, the way he cracked eggs against the rim of the bowl without looking, the way he plated food, setting the protein, then the sides, a quick wipe of the rim with the edge of a cloth, plate to the window. There was an economy to it that was genuinely satisfying to observe. Nothing extra. Nothing for the sake of appearance. Just the sequence of actions required to get the food from raw to plated, executed cleanly. He probably did not talk much during the rush. A short order cook who talked during the rush was a short order cook who was not paying attention to the griddle, and an inattentive griddle was the difference between lunch and a problem. He might say something between rushes during the slow mid-afternoon when the counter was half empty and the coffee was the only thing going. But at noon, he was working, and the work had his full attention, and the food on your plate was the proof of it. She wore a uniform, usually a pale blue or pink dress with a white apron over it, and her name was pinned to her chest in small block letters. She carried a coffee pot in one hand and the entire order in her mind, because the pad in her apron pocket was more for confirmation than calculation. She moved the counter like someone who knew every inch of it, refilling your cup before you thought to ask, sliding a plate down in front of you with a motion so practiced it had become automatic. She was not performing warmth. She either had it or she did not, and the ones who did had it in abundance. In a 1950s diner, the waitress was the whole atmosphere. The uniform was not glamorous and was not meant to be. It was practical. The dress was easy to wash and dried quickly. The apron had a large front pocket for the order pad and the pencil and the small pad of checks. The shoes were low-heeled and sturdy, chosen by someone who spent 8 hours on her feet and could not afford anything that looked more elegant. Then it was comfortable. The name pin was the one personal detail the uniform allowed, and it was a significant detail. It put a name to a face before any introduction had been made. You looked at her chest before. You looked at her face, and you knew her name before she said a word. In a room full of strangers, the name pin cut straight through the formality. She knew the counter the way you know a kitchen you have cooked in for years. Every surface, every drawer, every corner and tile. She knew which stools wobbled slightly and which ones did not. She knew where the afternoon sun came through the window and hit the pie case in a way that made the meringue look better than it actually was. She knew which customers left good tips and which ones never left anything, and she served them all the same, because the uniform required it and because, on some level, she was too professional to do otherwise. The coffee pot she carried was a glass Pyrex pot with a brown or black plastic handle, and it was almost always warm, almost always in her hand. Refills were not something you asked for. They were offered before you noticed your cup was low, set down with a small nod that did not interrupt whatever you were thinking about. In a full lunch rush, she might refill cups for 12 people in the time it took to walk the length of the counter once. The sequence was automatic. Pour, move, pour, move. Acknowledge the customer at the end who had just sat down. Pour, move. She was also a kind of social regulator for the room. Not formally, not because anyone had told her to be, but because she was in the room all day and the room was her responsibility. If a customer was rude to another customer, she would handle it quietly and without drama. If someone at the counter was clearly having a hard day, she might say something small and kind, nothing intrusive, just enough to acknowledge that she had noticed. She was not a counselor or a confidant by design. She was a waitress. But in a room where people came every day, she accumulated a kind of knowledge about the regulars that was both professional and genuinely personal. She knew who had lost a job recently. She knew who was expecting a grandchild. She knew because they had told her across the counter, in the small, easy conversations that happen in places where people feel comfortable. That kind of knowledge, accumulated over years of the same counter, the same stools, the same faces every Tuesday, was not something that transferred to any other job or any other setting. It lived in the diner between her and the room, and it was one of the things that made the room what it was. The coffee at a 1950s diner was not specialty coffee. It was not light roasted or single origin or described in terms of its tasting notes. It was diner coffee, which is a category unto itself. Dark, strong, slightly bitter, kept warm in a glass pot on a burner that had been on since before dawn. It tasted like the room it was, brewed in, like the griddle and the conversation and the particular time of morning. People drank it black or with cream and 2 sugars, and they drank several cups without giving it much thought. Modern coffee culture has made coffee something to consider, something with language around it. Diner coffee required no language. It was just what happened when you sat down. The coffee was brewed in a large commercial percolator, the kind that made 10 or 12 cups at a time, and sat on a heated base that kept the temperature steady, or close to steady for hours. The grounds were a commercial blend, bought in large cans, nothing artisanal about the sourcing or the roast profile. Dark roast, because dark roast hid minor variation in quality and held up better over the long hours between fresh brews. The flavor was assertive and direct. Bitter in the way that something strong and dark is bitter, not unpleasant, just honest. By the time it reached you, the coffee in that glass Pyrex pot had likely been sitting for an hour or more. This is considered a flaw by every standard of modern coffee culture, which is calibrated around freshness and precision. The diner did not share those values, not because it was indifferent to quality, but because it had a different definition of the word. Quality diner coffee meant coffee that tasted like itself, that was reliably warm, that arrived quickly, that you could drink 3 cups of without it going wrong on you. Freshness was not the point. Consistency was the point. The cup it came in was important. Heavy ceramic, thick-walled, white or off-white, sometimes with a pale blue stripe around the rim. The weight of it in your hand was part of the experience in a way that sounds trivial until you have spent time thinking about it. The cup was heavier than it needed to be. It retained heat. It did not feel disposable, did not feel temporary. Picking it up required a small, deliberate action, a curling of the fingers around something, solid. That solidity was part of the particular pleasure of diner coffee, the coffee inseparable from the cup it came in, the cup inseparable from the counter it sat on. Cream came in small glass pitchers or in individual glass cups with a foil lid, not in plastic pods that you tear open and struggle with. Sugar was in a glass shaker with a chrome lid, or in a bowl on the counter that everyone reached into. These were not design choices. They were just the way things were. But they meant that making your coffee the way you liked it was a small physical ritual, the pouring and the stirring, that lasted 5 seconds and settled you into the seat. The act of drinking 3 cups of diner coffee on a slow morning was a different act from drinking a single carefully constructed espresso beverage. It was not about the coffee, or not only about the coffee. It was about staying, about having a reason to sit for another 20 minutes. The waitress came by with a pot, and you did not cover your cup and say no thank you. You let her pour because the refill was the social permission to remain. 3 cups meant you had been somewhere. You had sat and been warm and watched the room go about its business and left the morning outside for a while. The coffee was the mechanism for all of that, dark and strong and slightly too long on the burner. Exactly right. It is early morning now, sometime before 8. You have come in before work, which means you are not the only one. The counter has a particular feel at this hour, quieter but purposeful. People who are somewhere to be, but not yet there. Your breakfast arrives on a plain white plate with no garnish and no ceremony. 2 eggs over easy, a strip or 2 of bacon, white toast already buttered, the butter melting into the bread while the plate is still warm. Hash browns on the side, press flat on the griddle until they are dark at the edges. It is a meal that fills you up without asking you to think about it. And that is exactly what the morning calls for. The plate itself was important. Plain white ceramic, heavy, the same plate that held the hot beef sandwich at lunch and the pie in the afternoon. It had no design or pattern. It was a surface for food, and it played that role without comment. When it came down in front of you, it came down with a soft, solid sound, not delicate, not careful, just placed. The eggs were cooked exactly as ordered, because the cook had been making eggs for years and knew the difference between over-easy and over-medium by looking. The yolk had that quality that a well-cooked over-easy egg has, slightly set on top but still liquid when you broke it, so that it ran into the hash browns in a slow gold stream that made the whole plate something more than the sum of its parts. The bacon was not the thick-cut artisan bacon of the modern brunch restaurant. It was standard diner bacon, the kind that crisped fully at the edges and stayed slightly softer in the middle, cooked on a flat griddle that had the memory of 1,000 previous strips of bacon built into its seasoning. It had a particular flavor, the fat rendered all the way, a slight char at the edge where it had touched the hottest part of the griddle. You ate it in 2 or 3 bites. It was not a centerpiece. It was a component, one element of a plate that worked together. The toast was white bread, always white bread, from a standard commercial loaf, toasted in a commercial toaster that did both sides at once. The butter was applied immediately, which meant it melted on contact, absorbing into the bread rather than sitting on top of it. This is a small but significant detail. Cold butter on toast produces a different texture and a different eating experience from melted butter. The diner gave you the melted version because the toast came straight off the toaster, and the butter was applied by someone who was not thinking about it, which was exactly the right way to apply butter to toast. Unconsciously, immediately, correctly. The hash browns, if the cook was good, were a thing worth noticing. Shredded potato, pressed flat on the griddle, left alone long enough to develop a crust on the bottom, then flipped once, the top side pressing against the hot surface and doing the same. The finished product was dark and crisp at the edges and yielding in the middle, seasoned with whatever salt and pepper had accumulated on that section of the griddle over the course of the morning. You did not need ketchup for hash browns cooked this way, though many people reach for the bottle anyway. Eating this breakfast before work, in that quiet, purposeful, pre-8 in the morning counter, was an act of preparation. Not for the day in any abstract sense. For the next few hours. The meal was caloric and warm and real in a way that filled you up without heaviness. And when you pushed the plate forward and finished the last of your coffee and put on your coat, you left the diner different from how you entered it, steadier, slightly more capable of whatever the morning was going to ask of you. The breakfast did not promise anything grand. It just prepared you for the ordinary, which was all it needed to do. The lunch counter at noon in a 1950s diner was a different world from the one that greeted you at breakfast. Every stool was taken. The cook was moving faster, calling things back, keeping the line clean. The sound level was higher, not loud exactly, but full, the way a room sounds when it is doing what it was built to do. You might wait a minute for a stool standing near the door without anyone needing to tell you the system. When one opened, you moved to it without hesitation. There was a rhythm to the lunch counter at noon, and it was not written anywhere. You simply fell into it, the way people fall into the pace of a city they have always lived in. The walk from the door to the counter at noon required a kind of navigation that was entirely social and entirely unspoken. You read the room as you walked in. You scanned the stools for the one that was about to open, the man already reaching for his coat, the woman sliding her check toward the edge of the counter. You positioned yourself near that stool without crowding the person still sitting in it, a proximity that said, "I am next," without saying anything at all. The person leaving would stand, gather themselves, and move toward the register, and you would slide onto the still warm stool in one continuous motion, as though the whole thing had been choreographed. The warmth of the stool was its own small sensation. Someone had been sitting there for 40 minutes. The vinyl held the heat of them for a minute or two after they left. You sat down into that residual warmth, and it was not unpleasant. It was evidence of use, of the continuous human occupation of the space, one person finishing and another beginning. The counter never fully empty during the noon hour, always in motion. The sound at noon was different from morning. The morning counter had a quiet purposefulness to it, people eating before work with one eye on the clock. Conversation kept brief. At noon, the clock still mattered. Most people had 40 minutes or an hour, but the quality of the urgency was different. The morning rush was about beginning the day. The lunch rush was about pausing it. People arrived tightly wound from the morning and sat down and let the room work on them for a few minutes before the food even arrived. The cook was louder now, the calls going back and forth across the counter, with more frequency, more volume, more of the compressed diner shorthand that sounded like its own language if you were not used to it. The waitress at noon was a different version of herself than the one who had worked the quiet morning. Not a different person, but a different gear Faster, more efficient, her movements tighter and more economical. The coffee pot always in motion, the pad always out. She did not stop moving during the noon rush. She redistributed herself across the counter in a constant flow, taking orders at one end while delivering food at the other, refilling cups on the way back, clearing plates on the way forward. Watching her work the noon rush from a counter stool was like watching someone manage a system that had no margin for error and did so without any appearance of strain. The food came faster at noon, not because it was less carefully made, but because the cook was in a different state during the rush, a heightened operational mode where the sequencing of orders was happening in his head simultaneously. Each plate tracked from the moment the order was called to the moment it went to the window. He was running several things at once, the way a musician plays multiple parts, keeping the rhythm of the griddle going across a dozen different orders without losing the thread of any of them. And then, sometime around 12:30, the rush would begin to ease. One stool would open, then two. The sound level would drop by a degree. The cook's pace would settle. The waitress would refill your cup and stay for a second, which during the rush she could not afford to do. The counter would move from full capacity back towards something comfortable. The noon rush at a 1950s diner lasted maybe 45 minutes. But while it lasted, the room was completely alive. There are things on the 1950s diner menu that modern restaurants have technically kept, but quietly changed beyond recognition. The hot beef sandwich is one of them. 2 slices of white bread laid open on a plain white plate. Sliced roast beef laid over both halves. Nothing fancy, the kind of beef that has been slow-cooked all morning. Brown gravy poured over everything, pooling into the bread, soaking through until the bread and the meat and the gravy are one thing. Mashed potatoes on the side, made from actual potatoes, not flakes. It was not elegant. It was not designed to be photographed. It was a meal built entirely around the idea that someone had worked a long morning and needed to eat something real. The roast beef started early. It went into the oven before the doors opened because it needed hours, low heat, and time to become the thing it needed to be by noon. The cook checked it at intervals, not with a thermometer, but with a fork, testing the give of the meat until it told him it was ready. When it came out and was sliced, the beef had that quality that only slow-roasted meat achieves, each slice holding its shape but yielding without resistance when you pressed a fork through it. The slices were not thin, not thick, somewhere in the middle, the kind of cut that absorbed gravy without disintegrating. The gravy was made from the drippings. This is important. Not from a packet or a commercial base, but from what was left in the pan after the roast came out, deglazed and thickened on the stovetop until it had the consistency and the depth of flavor that only comes from the fat and the juice of the specific piece of meat it accompanied. The gravy tasted like the roast, because it was the roast in another form. When it was poured over the open sandwich, still hot, it soaked into the bread immediately, changing the texture of the bread from soft to something denser and more substantial. A vehicle now rather than a base. The mashed potatoes were made from real potatoes, boiled and mashed with butter and whole milk and salt, and they were not smooth in the way that machine-processed potatoes are smooth. They had small lumps. They had texture. They tasted of potato and butter in a ratio that favored neither and was therefore exactly right. They were placed on the plate beside the open sandwich with a spoon, a rough mound that the gravy would eventually find its way to if you let it. Eating a hot beef sandwich required a fork and knife and a willingness to commit. There was no way to eat it tidily. The bread was soaked through within a minute of the plate arriving. The gravy ran. The potatoes were warm enough to steam slightly in the diner air. You ate it in a particular sequence that each person developed for themselves. Some starting at the edges where the bread was drier, some going straight for the middle where everything had merged. It did not matter. All paths through a hot beef sandwich arrived at the same place, which was full and warm and satisfied in the deep, uncomplicated way that a meal earns when it has been made correctly from honest ingredients. You can order a hot beef sandwich in certain diners still. The menu will describe something similar. But somewhere between then and now, the gravy changed, became a product rather than a process. And the bread changed, and the beef changed, and the result is a meal that references the original without being it. Not bad, just different in a way that is hard to name, but immediately apparent to anyone who ate the original version on a plain white plate on a cold Tuesday in 1958. The pie case stood near the register, a glass dome or low display case with a hinged lid, and it held 3 or 4 whole pies on any given day. Apple, cherry, chocolate cream, sometimes lemon meringue, its topping browned at the tips in a way that told you it had been made this morning. The slices were not small. Nobody was counting anything. You asked for a piece of pie, and someone cut it, slid it onto a plate, and set it in front of you with a fork. 15 cents. Maybe 20. The pie at a 1950s diner was made by someone who made pie every day, which meant it tasted like pie is supposed to taste, which is a thing that is getting harder and harder to find. The pie was made in the kitchen before the doors opened, which meant by the time you arrived at noon it had been cooling for hours and had reached that temperature between warm and room temperature that is the correct temperature for pie. Cooler than fresh. From the oven, but not refrigerator cold. The filling set and stable. The crust no longer steaming, but still slightly yielding at the bottom. A pie served at this temperature has a particular quality to it. The flavors are fully developed. The filling has had time to settle into itself. The crust, if it was made correctly, has finished its transition from baked dough to the crumbly, slightly flaky thing a good pie crust becomes when it is rested. The apple pie was the most common and the most reliable. Filling made from whatever apples were available and in season, sweetened and spiced with cinnamon, and sometimes a small amount of nutmeg. Thickened with flour or cornstarch until it held its shape when cut, but still moved slightly. The juice concentrated into something between syrup and jam. The top crust was double, a full pastry lid crimped at the edges, brushed with egg or milk before baking. To achieve that particular brown that is the visual promise of a good apple pie. A slice of it on a plain white plate, a fork beside it, nothing else required. The lemon meringue was a different undertaking. The filling required attention. The lemon curd cooked to exactly the right temperature and consistency. Enough acid to cut through the sweetness. Enough sugar to hold the brightness without tipping it into sourness. The meringue was applied while the curd was still warm, spread to the edges, so it sealed against the crust, and did not weep, then browned in the oven until the peaks were golden. The result, when it was done correctly, was a piece of pie that looked more impressive than the apple pie, more constructed, more deliberate. It tasted of Sunday afternoon. The chocolate cream pie needed no oven after the shell was baked. The filling was a cooked pudding poured into the cooled shell and allowed to set overnight, topped with whipped cream that had been made that morning. It was cold, where the others were room temperature, and that coldness was part of its character. The filling dense and smooth, the whipped cream light against it, the chocolate flavor deep and straightforward. Sitting at the counter in the mid-afternoon, the lunch rush over, the room quieter, and ordering a piece of pie and a cup of coffee was one of the small rituals of the 1950s diner that had no equivalent in the faster, more transactional world that replaced it. You were not there for a meal. You were there for 15 minutes of pie and warmth and the low sound of a room going about its afternoon. The pie case near the register held all of that in potential. You just had to ask. Let's talk about the numbers for a moment, because they matter more than they might seem. A bowl of tomato soup for $0.25, grilled cheese for 35 cents. A full breakfast with eggs, bacon, toast, and coffee for under $1. A slice of pie for 15 cents. These were not special prices or loss leaders. This was simply what food cost. The diner was not a luxury. It was not a treat reserved for certain occasions. It was just where you went when you needed to eat and you were already downtown. The accessibility of it, the absolute ordinariness of it, was the whole point. Eating out in a 1950s diner felt no different from eating at home, except that someone else did the cooking. To understand what these prices meant in practice, it helps to think about what else a quarter bought in 1955. A payphone call cost a nickel. A first-class stamp was 3 cents. A gallon of gasoline was around 22 cents. A new car cost around $1,800. The minimum wage was 75 cents an hour. Against that backdrop, a bowl of soup for $0.25 and a full breakfast for under $1 represented roughly what food was worth relative to everything else. Not cheap exactly, not expensive either, just proportionate. A working person earning the minimum wage could have a full lunch at the counter for about 40 minutes of labor. The diner was priced for the people who used it. What this meant in practical terms was that the diner was genuinely accessible to most people who worked downtown. The factory workers, the office clerks, the telephone operators, the men from the loading dock who had 40 minutes at noon. Nobody had to save up for the diner the way people save for restaurants now. Nobody had to choose between eating out and eating that week. The counter was simply there, within the daily budget of anyone who needed it, which meant that everyone used it and everyone sat together, and the democratic quality of the space was underwritten by the democratic quality of the pricing. The check at the end of the meal was written on a small paper pad by the waitress, the items listed in pencil, the total at the bottom in a column. You took it to the register and paid the woman there, not your waitress, the separation of service and payment being its own small piece of the system. The register was a mechanical one, the keys requiring actual pressure, the drawer opening with a bell of its own. You received change from a real cash drawer, counted out by hand. The transaction was entirely physical, entirely present. Tipping was a custom, but not the elaborate calculus it has become. A few cents on a small check, a dime on a large one. Enough to acknowledge the service, not enough to function as a significant portion of the waitress's income, though in practice it often did. The tip was left on the counter when you stood to leave, set beside the empty cup, a small, quiet acknowledgement that someone had taken care of you and you had noticed. These prices held a particular value beyond their face amount. They said that the diner trusted you to come back, that it was not trying to extract maximum value from each transaction, because it understood that the relationship was ongoing, that you would be here tomorrow and the day after, and that keeping the food affordable was how the counter kept the room full. There is a kind of generosity embedded in low prices when the business behind them is genuinely trying to serve the people who need it. The 1950s diner understood that. Here is something about the counter that gets lost in the telling. The stool to your left might hold a factory worker still in his work clothes. The stool to your right might hold the man who owns the hardware store 2 doors down, a mother with a toddler on her lap, an older man eating alone and reading a folded newspaper. The counter made no distinctions. It had no sections, no tables designated for certain kinds of people. You showed up, you sat down, you were served. The same menu, the same coffee, the same waitress who knew your name if you came in often enough. There was a kind of democracy in that arrangement that was quiet and unannounced, and all the more real for it. The physical arrangement of the counter made this mixing inevitable. Unlike a dining room full of tables, where parties self-select into their own private units and can spend an entire meal without acknowledging the people beside them, the counter put you in a row, shoulder to shoulder with whoever had arrived before you and whoever arrived after. The stools were close enough that a conversation could happen naturally without raising your voice, and far enough apart that not having a conversation was also natural and required no explanation. You could talk or not talk, and both were acceptable, and neither required justification. What this meant in practice was that on any given morning, a cross-section of the town's working life sat at the same counter and ate the same food and drank the same coffee. The doctor who had finished his early rounds came in for breakfast 2 stools down from the man who had been sweeping floors at the mill since 5 in the morning. They did not necessarily speak, but they shared the room and the counter and the same plate of eggs. And there was something in that shared ordinariness that worked against the calcification of a social distance in a way that more formal settings did not. Children absorbed this without knowing it. If you were brought to the diner counter as a child, which many children were, you sat in a room where the adult world presented itself without hierarchy, without the visible markers of status that separate people in other settings. The man in the work clothes and the man in the suit occupied the same stool at the same counter and were treated with the same water glass and the same pencil hovering over the same pad. That image lodged somewhere in a child's understanding of how the world worked, and it was not a bad image to carry. There were limits to this democracy, and they should be named. In the segregated South, the lunch counter was not open to everyone. The ordinariness and dignity that white customers took for granted at the counter was explicitly denied to Black Americans in many parts of the country, and the 1960 sit-ins were a direct confrontation with that denial. The democracy of the counter was real for those it included, and that inclusion was not universal. What the sit-ins made clear was that the values the counter represented, the right to sit down, to be served, to be treated as a person who deserved to eat, were values worth claiming for everyone. The counter was worth fighting for because what it offered at its best was genuinely worth having. For those who were welcome at the counter, the daily reminder that you shared your city with people whose lives were different from yours, and that those lives converged here, over soap and coffee and pie, was a kind of quiet social education. It did not solve anything. It did not dissolve the real differences between people, but it kept those differences from hardening completely. And in the accumulated ordinary of 1,000 noon hours side by side, it built something modest and real. Close your eyes for a moment and listen. The sakumachi ov. Flat griddle makes a steady sound, a low continuous sizzle with occasional spikes when something new goes on. The coffee pot taps against a ceramic cup. Stools shift. Someone sets a glass down. Conversation runs at a particular volume. Not quiet, but not loud. The kind of sound a room makes when people are comfortable. A bell rings above the door. Outside a car passes. Back here, none of that matters much. The sound of a 1950s diner at noon is a specific frequency, and if you have ever sat in one, you still carry it somewhere in your body, the way you carry the sound of a room you spent a lot of time in as a child. Start with the griddle, because the griddle was always there, underneath everything else, the bass note of the room. It was not a dramatic sound. It was steady and continuous and low, a persistent sizzle that rose slightly when something cold went onto the hot surface and settled back to its baseline a minute later. That sound told you, without your having to, look, that food was being made right now. It was the audio equivalent of the smell from the sidewalk, the room announcing its primary function through your ears before you could see the cook working. The coffee pot had its own sound, glass against ceramic, a particular tap that happened dozens of times an hour as the waitress moved the pot to the cup and tipped it and moved on. Not a clink, not a clash, something lighter and more deliberate. If you had your eyes closed, you could track her movement along the counter by the sequence of that sound. Cup to cup, a small percussion line running the length of the room. The sound of a refill being poured was specific too. The gurgling rush of coffee into a ceramic cup, stopping just short of the rim. A sound that meant warmth and continuation. The stools contributed a low background rhythm. A swivel movement produced a soft creak from the bolted post. Shifting weight on the vinyl made a small friction sound. Someone placing their elbows on the counter produced a soft thud. These were not noticeable sounds individually. Together they made up a layer of human physical presence, the acoustic texture of a room full of people in proximity, each one generating small sounds, just by being there and being alive and going about their meal. Conversation at the counter happened at a specific volume, not quiet because the room had enough ambient sound that quiet conversation would not carry, but not raised either. The conversational volume of a diner was the volume of people who were comfortable, who were not performing for a room but were simply talking. If someone laughed, the laugh was genuine and immediate and did not feel like an intrusion. If someone at the end of the counter said something to the cook, the words carried clearly without effort. The acoustic design of the room, if it had been designed at all, which it had not, was accidentally correct for human conversation. There was no music in most 1950s diners during the day. The jukebox, if there was one, was an evening or weekend thing, or something for the slow mid-afternoon. During the morning and lunch rush, the room provided its own sound, and the sound was sufficient. It was the sound of work and company and appetite, of a room doing what it was made to do. You do not notice a sound like that while it's happening. You notice it years later in its absence, when you walk into a quiet modern restaurant with ambient music piped through ceiling speakers and realize that the music is there to fill a silence that a well-used room would never have had. You could eat a full meal at the counter in 20 minutes if you needed to. Nobody rushed you if you did not. That was the whole arrangement. The food came fast, because the menu was built for speed, and the cook had done it all 1,000 times. But once the plate was in front of you, the pace was yours. You could finish, push the plate forward, get one more cup of coffee, and sit there for another half hour without anyone glancing at the door or sliding a check at you. Time at the counter was not managed. It was available. In a modern restaurant, even a casual one, there is a rhythm being managed around you, a table turn to consider, a line forming. The diner had no table to turn. The stool was yours for as long as you needed it. This was not a policy anyone had thought through or written down. It was simply the nature of the counter. The stools were fixed, not assignable, not bookable. They did not belong to any particular customer for any particular duration. They were first come. When one opened, you took it. and when you were done, you stood up and left. The implicit understanding was that during a rush, you did not linger indefinitely, not because anyone would tell you to leave, but because you could see the person standing by the door, and you are not that kind of person. During the slow hours, no such pressure existed. You could order a piece of pie and a cup of coffee at 2 p.m. and still be there at 3, and nobody would notice or care. There is something about that availability of time that is worth sitting with, because it represents a relationship with public space that has become genuinely rare. The modern coffee shop has tables and chairs and Wi-Fi, and you can stay for hours. But the understanding is commercial. You are there because you bought something, and the purchase bought you time. And the staff is aware of how long you have been there in a way the diner waitress was not. The diner counter asked nothing of your time beyond the meal. When the meal was finished, the remaining time was yours freely, without the quiet accounting of a space that is measuring its hospitality against your check. This affected how people experienced the counter. It made it possible to arrive wound up from the morning and leave settled. Not because anything dramatic had happened, just because the room had given you 20 minutes or 40 minutes in which the pace was yours. The cook was moving, the waitress was moving, but you were not. You were still, with a cup in front of you and a plate being cleared, and the room was going about its business without requiring anything from you. The check was always made available, but never pressed on you. It would be placed near your plate or beside your cup at some point after the meal. But placing it there was not a signal to leave. It was just logistics. You would pick it up when you were ready and take it to the register, and that would be the end of it. Nobody slid the check to you with a particular look or asked if you were ready to close out or began clearing the table while you were still sitting in it. The diner's relationship to time was generous in a way that required no announcement. Looking back at it now, across the distance of decades and the changes in how public spaces have been redesigned around revenue per seat per hour, that generosity looks like a different philosophy entirely. Not a philosophy of charity, a philosophy of the long view. The diner knew that the customer who sat for an extra half hour over coffee was the same customer who came back tomorrow and brought someone with them the week after. Time given freely was time that accumulated interest. The stool was available, and the coffee was warm, and there was no hurry. That was the offer. It was a good one. If you came in often enough, you became a regular. This happened without ceremony or announcement. It happened the day the waitress started writing down your order before you opened your mouth. The tomato soup and grilled cheese. The 2 eggs over easy with extra toast. The coffee black, no sugar. Being a regular at a diner in the 1950s was a small thing, but small things add up. It meant there was a place in the world where you were expected, where your arrival caused a small, quiet adjustment in the room. A cup pulled from the stack, an order remembered. It is the kind of being known that does not ask anything of you, does not require explanation or performance, and is all the warmer for that. The transition from stranger to regular happened gradually and then all at once. The first few times you came in, you were a new face, noted but not yet known. The waitress gave you the full menu treatment, read you the specials if there were any, waited for you to decide. By the 3rd or 4th visit, if you had ordered the same thing each time, which most people did, because most people are creatures of habit, and the diner's short menu reinforced those habits, she had begun to connect your face to your order. The day she reached for the coffee cup before you sat down fully was the day you became a regular, No ceremony, no acknowledgement, just the small practical evidence that you had been absorbed into the room's memory. Being a regular carried certain small privileges that were never explicitly offered. Your coffee arrived faster. If you arrived during the rush and every stool was full, the waitress might catch your eye at the door and hold up a finger, meaning 1 minute. I see you. If you were running late and your usual order was something the cook had to start from scratch, he might already have it going because he had noticed what time it was and you were not there yet. These were not favors. They were the natural expression of a working relationship that had developed over time, the way any ongoing relationship develops its own shortcuts and accommodations. The regular also knew things about the diner that the occasional visitor did not. Which stool wobbled? Which section of the counter got the draft from the door in winter? Which days the lemon meringue was freshest because it had been made that morning rather than the day before? This knowledge accumulated without effort, deposited by repeated experience, until it became part of how you moved through the space. You came in, and without thinking, you went to the right end of the counter where the heat from the grill carried most warmly. You knew without looking that the sugar dispenser on the far left was usually empty by 10 in the morning. The other regulars were part of it too. You came to know them by their routines, if not their names. The man who came in every weekday at 7:15 and always had oatmeal and read the paper. The 2 women from the telephone exchange who came together every Wednesday for lunch and always ordered the soup. You did not necessarily speak to these people, but you recognized them, and they recognized you, and that recognition was its own form of community, loose and undemanding, requiring nothing beyond showing up in the same place, at roughly the same time, with reasonable regularity. There is a word for what the regular had at the diner that is hard to find in a single syllable. It was not friendship exactly, and not membership, and not belonging in the sense of belonging to an organization. It was closer to being anchored. The diner was a fixed point in the week, a place where the terms were known, and the outcome was reliable, and someone had noticed that you existed and filed that information away and would act on it the next time you walked through the door. In a life full of things that shifted and changed and made demands, the counter was simply there, steady, the same coffee, the same stool, the same voice asking what it was going to be today. The modern diner still exists. You can find one in almost any city, usually with a name that includes the word classic or original, with a menu that runs to 12 pages and a pie case near the register and stools at the counter. And some of what made the 1950s diner real is still there. The counter, the coffee, the breakfast plates, the particular low light that seems to belong to diners the way no other kind of restaurant claims it. But something in the pacing has changed. The menu is longer because abundance became the point, somewhere along the way. The coffee comes in varieties. The stools are the same, but the room around them feels managed now, curated, designed to feel casual rather than simply being so. What the modern diner kept most faithfully was the physical form. The counter is still there. The stools are still bolted to the floor, or near enough. The pie case still stands near the register. The coffee still comes in a ceramic cup, and refills are still offered without being charged. These are not trivial things. They are the skeleton of the original, and the skeleton is intact. Walk into a good modern diner, and the room will do something to you immediately. Something that no other kind of restaurant replicates. A lowering of the shoulders, a settling in, a sense that this is a place where the terms are simple and the expectations are mutual. Also, what changed first was the menu. The 1950s diner menu had perhaps a dozen items. The modern diner menu has perhaps 100, organized into sections with subsections, breakfast available all day, lunch items that shade into dinner items, a page of specials and a page of desserts, and a separate laminated card for the seasonal offerings. The abundance is genuine and is genuinely the result of wanting to offer more, to accommodate more people with more preferences. But the short menu of the original diner had something the long menu cannot replicate. It made decisions easy. It created reliability. And it told you, implicitly, that everything listed was something the kitchen knew how to make well. What changed second was the pacing. The table turn is a reality in modern restaurants in a way it was not at the counter in 1955. Not because modern diners are cruel or inhospitable, but because the economics of the operation require more throughput. More people through the same space in the same number of hours means more revenue on the same square footage. The check arrives a little sooner now. The refills are offered, but the offer has a slight efficiency to it, a suggestion of forward motion that the old diner did not have. You can still sit for a while at a modern diner counter, but the set has a texture to it that is slightly different, slightly more aware of itself. What was lost most completely was the relationship between the staff and the customer that only develops over years in the same room with the same people. The waitress who knew your order before you sat down was a product of continuity, of the same person working the same counter for years, accumulating knowledge of a specific community of regulars who were themselves stable enough in their routines to be known. Modern labor markets are more fluid. People move more. The decades-long career at the same diner counter is rarer now. The accumulation of knowledge about people and their habits and their preferences that made the regular feel genuinely known requires a stability that is harder to maintain. None of this is a criticism of the modern diner, which is doing what it can with the conditions it has. It is simply the shape of what changed, named as honestly as possible. The modern diner tries. Some of them succeed more than others. And when you sit at a good one in the low light, with a ceramic cup warming your hands, the distance between now and then collapses a little. Not all the way, but enough to remember what it felt like, enough to be grateful it still exists in any form. Not everyone sat at the counter. The booths along the wall were there for couples, for families with small children, for anyone who wanted a little more privacy than a stool allowed. The booths had high backs, upholstered in the same vinyl as the stools, dark red or green, worn at the edges. The table between you was Formica, easy to wipe clean, always slightly cool to the touch. Sitting in a booth felt different from sitting at the counter, more enclosed, more like a meal and less like a pause in the day. The waitress came to you. The food arrived, the same way. But the booth was a room within the room, and choosing it meant something about what you needed from the hour. The booths in a 1950s diner were arranged along the wall opposite the counter, or sometimes along a side wall if the room was wide enough, facing inward toward the center of the space. Their backs were high enough to create a sense of enclosure without isolating you completely from the room. You were in the diner, aware of the counter and the cook and the sound of the room, but at one remove from it. The booth offered a middle ground between the exposure of the counter and the privacy of a table, at a restaurant designed around privacy. You were present in the room without being inside it. The table in the booth was Formica, which is important to the sensory memory of the thing. Formica was the material of the era, practical and durable, slightly cold to the touch, easy to clean with a damp cloth. The pattern varied by diner, but often had a kind of mid-century print to it, small geometric shapes, or a marbled texture in pale colors. The surface never felt soft. It had no give. When you set your cup down on it, the sound was brighter, sharper, than the sound of a cup on the padded rail of the counter. The table was honest in the way that Formica is honest. It was exactly what it appeared to be, and asked nothing more of itself. The booth bench was vinyl, the same material as the stools, the same general colors, and the padding underneath had usually been compressed by years of use until it was firmer than new padding. Sitting in an old diner booth had a particular feel. The vinyl slightly slick, the padding solid beneath it, the back of the bench upright enough that you sat straight without quite meaning to. Families with young children chose the booths because a child in a booth was contained in a way a child on a counter stool was not. The enclosed space was its own kind of management. The child had nowhere to go except the length of the bench, and the bench was bounded on both sides. Couples chose the booth for different reasons. The face-to-face arrangement of a booth table, unlike the side-by-side arrangement of the counter, made conversation the default. You were across from each other, your faces the thing in front of each other, which meant you either talked or you felt the silence of not talking more acutely. The counter allowed silence to be natural and unloaded. The booth made silence a choice, which changed its quality. Sitting across from someone in a diner booth and not talking was either very comfortable or very uncomfortable, depending entirely on the nature of the relationship, and that particular dynamic has not changed at all. The booth and the counter together gave the diner a range of social configurations that no single seating type could have provided alone. You came in alone and wanted to be in the room without being exposed. You chose the counter. You came in with someone and wanted to face them. You chose the booth. You came in with children who needed to be managed. You chose the booth. The diner accommodated all of these needs within the same room, with the same menu, the same coffee, the same plain white plates coming out of the same kitchen. 2 ways to sit, 1 place to be. In a lot of diners, there was a jukebox, not always in the center of the room, like a centerpiece. Sometimes it stood against the far wall. Sometimes there were small table-mounted selectors in the booths that fed into it. 3 songs for $0.25. You flipped through the selections on a card, the titles typed on small strips of paper behind a plastic window. You made your choice. The mechanism inside clunked and turned, and then the music came, not too loud, not background noise exactly, something in between. A 1950s diner with a jukebox had a sound that no playlist curated by an algorithm has ever quite replicated, because the choice was made by someone in the room, for the room in that moment. The jukebox itself was a physical presence in a way that a speaker mounted in a ceiling is not. It had a body, a curved top of chrome and colored plastic, often with a lit interior that glowed amber or pink or green, the colors of a certain kind of American commercial design that has not been replicated since, because nobody has needed to replicate it. The selections were visible behind the curved glass window. Small cards with song titles and artist names, typed in capital letters, organized by number. You turned a knob or pressed a button to flip through them, the cards rotating past the window one at a time, with a soft mechanical click. The searching was part of it. You were not given a list. You moved through the list at your own pace, the way you might flip through a rack of records in a store. When you made your selection and dropped the quarter in, the mechanism engaged with a sound that was its own small drama. A clunk of the arm moving, a whir of the Record being selected and lifted and placed. A moment of mechanical preparation, audible and unhurried, before the needle dropped and the music began. That gap between the coin and the song was not dead time. It was anticipation. The room heard the mechanism engage and knew that something was about to happen. And for 2 or 3 seconds the counter continued its business while the machine prepared itself. Then the music. Not through a ceiling speaker, but through the jukebox itself, which had its own sound, warm and slightly full. The frequency shaped by the speaker inside that curved cabinet. The volume was calibrated for a diner room, loud enough to be present, not so loud as to prevent conversation. It occupied its own layer of the room's sound without displacing the griddle or the coffee pot or the conversation. Songs in the 1950s were short. 2.5 minutes, 3 minutes at most. You got your 3 songs for a quarter, which lasted somewhere between 7 and 10 minutes, and then the room returned to its own sound. What made the jukebox different from any modern equivalent was the human intention behind each song. Someone in the room had chosen those 3 songs in that order at that moment. Not a streaming service responding to aggregate listening data, not an algorithm trained on similar rooms. A specific person sitting in a specific booth or standing beside the machine for a moment on their way to the counter had decided that this was what the room needed to hear right now. That intention was invisible, but present. It gave the music a quality of belonging. To the moment, the curated background music, however well chosen, cannot replicate. The jukebox was also, in certain hours and certain diners, a social object. Someone would make a selection, and someone else at the counter would react, a nod of approval or a mild complaint that was not entirely serious. The cook might have opinions about what got played during the lunch rush. Teenagers in the afternoon would cluster around the selection mechanism, negotiating over which songs, the quarter a shared resource requiring consensus. The music the jukebox played was not just music. It was a small, ongoing conversation between the people in the room about what the room should sound like, conducted in 3-song increments for a quarter at a time. There is a chapter of this story that cannot be left out, because the lunch counter was not equally open to everyone, and that matters. In the segregated South, Black Americans were refused service at the same counters where white customers sat and ate, without thinking about the right to be there. On the first day of February, 1960, 4 black college students sat down at the Woolworth's counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, and asked to be served. They were refused. They stayed in their seats. What followed spread across the country in weeks. The lunch counter, that ordinary, unremarkable fixture of daily American life, became the place where the right to ordinary, unremarkable daily life was demanded. The stool, the counter, the cup of coffee, none of them were ever entirely simple after that. The 4 students were Ezel Blair Jr., Franklin McCain, Joseph McNeil, and David Richmond, freshmen at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College. They sat at the Woolworth's lunch counter on a Monday afternoon and ordered coffee. The waitress told them the counter did not serve colored people. They remained in their seats until the store closed. They came back the next day with more students. The day after that, more still. Within a week, the sit-in had attracted national attention. Within weeks, similar demonstrations had begun in cities across the South. The tactic was simple, almost elegant in its simplicity. You sat down. You asked to be served. You stayed. What they were sitting at was not a symbol. It was a lunch counter. The same lunch counter described in everything preceding this, the same stools, and the same formica and the same pie case near the register. The ordinariness of the object was precisely the point. The lunch counter in 1955 American life was so thoroughly ordinary, so entirely unremarkable, that being refused access to it was a crystalline demonstration of what segregation actually meant in daily life. Not just in courtrooms or on buses or in schools, though it meant those things too. Here, at noon, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, a person who needed to eat could be told that this particular place where people ate was not for them. The lunch counter sit-ins worked in part because the lunch counter itself had a particular place in the American self-image. It was democratic. It was accessible. It was the place where the businessmen and the factory workers ate the same food at the same counter. That was the story Americans told about it. The sit-ins held that story up against the reality of what the counter actually was in the segregated South and asked the country to look at the gap between the two. The gap was impossible to look away from once it was visible. By July of 1960, the Greensboro Woolworths counter was desegregated. The tactic spread and evolved, and the sit-ins became a foundational strategy of the civil rights movement. But the lunch counter remained the image that anchored it. Because the lunch counter was so legible, so known, so entirely part of everyday life, the act of claiming it was immediately understandable in a way that more abstract battles for rights were not. A seat at the counter, a cup of coffee, the right to be served the same food on the same plate with the same fork as the person sitting one stool down. When you sit at a diner counter today, even now, even in a place with no living memory of what happened in Greensboro or the dozens of cities that followed, you are sitting at an object that carried the full weight of what it means to belong somewhere. The imhi homini chet. Stool is just a stool, and it is also everything that was ever fought for at a lunch counter. Both of those things are true at the same time, and the second one does not diminish the first. It enlarges it. Through the 1950s, something was shifting underneath the lunch counter without anyone quite seeing it yet. The population was moving. Families were leaving downtown neighborhoods for new suburbs built around the automobile, and the drive to work replaced the walk past the diner. The foot traffic that fed the lunch counter, those people already downtown, already passing the door on their way to somewhere else, began to thin. It did not happen overnight. But by the early 1960s, the counters in the Kresge's and Woolworth stores that had anchored American downtowns were beginning to see fewer faces. And the fast food restaurant built for the car, designed to feed people who did not want to park, was already waiting at the edge of every new suburb. The post-war suburb was built on an assumption that had never fully existed before and has never quite been reversed since. The assumption was that distance was manageable, that spreading out across the landscape was a reasonable response to the desire for more space and more privacy, and that the car would stitch everything back together. In 1950 and 1951 and 1952, families moved into new houses on new streets in new communities that had no downtown, no post office on the corner, no diner 2 blocks from work. They drove to everything. The car was not a convenience in the suburb. It was the infrastructure. What this did to the lunch counter was gradual and then decisive. The counter had always depended on pedestrian proximity. You stopped in because you were already there, already in the rhythm of downtown, already passing the door. The suburb removed that rhythm entirely. There was no passing the door on the way to the office. You drove from your house to a parking lot and you drove back. The spontaneous mid-morning stop, the natural noon diversion from the daily route, the mid-afternoon pie, All of it depended on a kind of urban proximity that the suburb was specifically designed to dissolve. Downtown did not disappear immediately. Through the 1950s, the commercial centers of most American cities remained functional and populated. But the trend was established, and its direction was clear. As the suburbs grew, the tax base and the retail energy of American towns began to follow them outward. Department stores opened suburban branches. Supermarkets followed the population. By the early 1960s, the great downtown Woolworths and Kresge's stores that had anchored Main Street for decades were watching their foot traffic numbers decline year after year. The interstate highway system, authorized by Congress in 1956, accelerated everything. It made long-distance driving practical, connected the suburbs to the cities with high-speed corridors, and created the roadside commercial strip as a feature of American life. The roadside strip was not designed for walking. It was designed for driving past at speed and pulling in. The businesses that prospered on the roadside strip were the businesses that could be read from a moving car, entered quickly, exited without fuss. The diner could adapt to this format to some degree. But the lunch counter, embedded inside a retail store that depended on foot traffic, could not. It was a pedestrian institution in a world that was re-engineering itself around the windshield. By the time most people noticed that the downtown lunch counter was disappearing, it had mostly already gone. The stools came out. The griddles went cold. The stores that had housed them either converted or closed. The long Main Street retail model unable to survive the competition of the suburban mall. What had taken decades to build was dismantled in a decade and a half, not because anyone decided it was worth dismantling, but because the ground underneath it had moved and it had not moved with it. McDonald's opened its first franchise location in 1955, the same year a lot of those downtown lunch counters were still full at noon. The comparison is not about quality. It is about what each one was designed to do. The lunch counter was built around stopping, sitting, being served, being in a room with other people for 20 minutes or an hour. The fast food restaurant was built around the opposite, getting food and leaving, staying in your car if possible. McDonald's was 15 cents for a hamburger, and it was fast, and it was exactly right for the suburb and the highway and the America that was being built. What was traded was not obvious at the time. It is more obvious now. Ray Kroc opened that first McDonald's franchise in Des Plaines, Illinois, on the 15th of April, 1955. The menu was focused to a degree that made even the diner menu look expansive. Hamburgers, cheeseburgers, French fries, shakes, soft drinks, coffee. The prices were structured around the automobile customer, someone who had pulled off the road and wanted to eat and get back on it. The kitchen was designed around speed and consistency, standardized procedures that could be replicated by any worker in any location with minimal training. The food was the same in Des Plaines as it would be in the next franchise and the one after that. Predictability was the product as much as the hamburger. This was a fundamentally different offer from the diner. The diner's consistency came from the cook who had been making the same dishes for years. A human consistency, variable within a narrow range, shaped by skill and habit and the particular qualities of that cook's long experience. McDonald's consistency was procedural, built into the system rather than into the person, which meant it could scale in ways the diner never could. By 1960, McDonald's had over 200 locations. By 1965, over 700. The lunch counter could not be franchised. The relationship between the cook and the counter and the regular was not transferable. It lived in one place, and that was the whole of it. What was traded at the operational level was labor and relationship, for speed and scale. The diner required a skilled cook, experienced counter staff, a daily prep process that could not be shortcut without changing the food. McDonald's required people who could be trained in a day to follow a procedure, which made it far less dependent on any individual worker and far more capable of expanding rapidly. The trade was rational from a business perspective, and the market confirmed it decisively. Fast food grew, and the lunch counter did not. What was traded at the human level is harder to quantify but real. The diner counter was a room where you sat down, and someone brought you food, and you were in the company of other people going about their day. The fast food restaurant, especially after the drive-thru became standard in the 1970s and 80s, made it possible to eat without getting out of your car, without sitting near anyone, without anyone knowing your name or your order. The efficiency was genuine. The isolation was also genuine. Neither the lunch counter nor the fast food restaurant was simply good or simply bad. They were answers to different questions asked by different versions of American life. The lunch counter answered the question of how to feed people who were already downtown and had 20 minutes. Fast food answered the question of how to feed people who were in their cars and wanted to stay in them. As the country reorganized itself around the second question, the first one stopped being asked as often. And the room that had been built to answer it, with the stools and the griddle and the pie case and the waitress who knew your name, grew quieter and then empty and then gone. It is worth sitting with this for a moment before we close. The 1950s diner was not trying to be anything more than what it was: a room where you could get food quickly, at a price that expected nothing of you, in the company of other people who were simply going about their day. There was no concept behind it, no brand identity, no carefully designed atmosphere. It was just there, as reliably as the sidewalk outside, as ordinary as a Tuesday. And that ordinariness, that complete lack of ambition, beyond feeding people well and sending them back into their day, is exactly what made it so difficult to replace. We have built a great many things since then, but we have not built another lunch counter. Not really. The diner did not know it was doing something valuable. That is important. The cook who arrived before dawn and put the roast in the oven was not thinking about community or democracy or the social fabric of American civic life. He was thinking about the roast. The waitress who refilled your cup before you asked was not enacting a philosophy of hospitality. She was doing her job efficiently, which in her hands looked like warmth because it was built from genuine attention to the people in front of her. The ordinariness of the operation was not incidental to its value. It was the source of it. The diner was good at what it was because it was not trying to be anything else. What we lost when the lunch counter closed was not just a place to eat. We lost a specific kind of public space that no subsequent institution has replaced in kind. The food court feeds more people more quickly in a larger space. The coffee shop offers longer hours and Wi-Fi and the permission to work. The casual restaurant offers more variety and more comfort. Each of these is a genuine improvement on at least one dimension of what the lunch counter offered. And none of them is the same thing. The lunch counter was a space of low-stakes daily presence. You could be in it without belonging to it. You could be alone without being isolated. You could be among people without having to engage with them. The counter arrangement, everybody pointing the same direction, shoulder to shoulder with strangers going about their own meals, made solitude companionable in a way that the table arrangement of every subsequent eating establishment has not managed to replicate. You were part of something without having joined anything. That particular quality of public life, unremarkable when it existed, is remarkably difficult to find now. It pulls at something in people who experienced it because what it offered was ordinary in the best sense of the word. Not dramatic, not designed, not optimized for anything beyond the daily requirement of feeding people who were nearby and needed to eat. The coffee was reliable. The food was honest. The stool was there every morning in the same place. In a world that asks you constantly to adapt and update and choose between proliferating options, the counter's steadiness was a form of grace that nobody named at the time because it did not need naming. It was simply there. If you ate at one of these counters, you carry the memory of it with a specificity that other memories do not quite match. You remember which stool, which town, which diner, the sound of the swivel, the weight of the cup, the particular way the plate came down in front of you without ceremony. You remember the name on the waitress's pin. You remember what you ordered, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was yours. The same thing every Tuesday for 10 years, which is the way you know something has become part of how you live. Somewhere in the back of a Woolworth's or a Kresge's, on a Tuesday that looked like every other Tuesday, someone set a plate of food in front of you and asked if you needed anything else. The griddle was going. The coffee was warm. The stool next to you held someone going about their day, same as you. That was the whole of it. That was enough for a long time. And if it pulls at something in you now, sitting here in the present, further from that Tuesday than it sometimes feels, it is because some things that are ordinary are also irreplaceable, and the heart knows the difference, even when the mind has moved on. It is mid-morning now, sometime between the breakfast rush and the noon crowd. Let's step away from the standalone diner for a moment and walk into a place that served the same function in a different setting. The drugstore counter was the lunch counter's quieter cousin, tucked into the back of a pharmacy behind the aspirin and the hair combs and the rotating rack of paperback novels. It had fewer stools, a shorter menu, a smaller griddle, but it had the same cup, the same coffee, the same plain white plate coming down in front of you without ceremony. In certain towns across America, the drugstore counter was where you went when the diner was full, or when you needed something quieter than the diner offered, or simply because it was closer and the morning was cold and you did not want to walk another block. The drugstore in the 1950s was not merely a pharmacy. It was a retail institution that served as one of the organizing fixtures of American small-town and urban life. You went there for prescriptions, yes, but also for cosmetics, for greeting cards, for school supplies, for the paperback on the wire rack by the door, for the small practical necessities of daily life that a pharmacy happened to stock because its customers happened to need them. The counter in the back was an extension of that logic. People were already in the store. They might as well have lunch while they were there. The drugstore counter was typically smaller than the diner, 8 or 10 stools rather than 20, a shorter run of counter with a more compact kitchen behind it. The menu was abbreviated accordingly. Sandwiches rather than full plates. Soup. A grilled. Cheese. A tuna salad on white. The fountain was often the centerpiece, which meant sodas and milkshakes and ice cream sundaes occupied a place on the menu that the diner, which was primarily a food operation, did not always emphasize. You could get a lime Ricky at the drugstore counter. You could get a chocolate phosphate. You could get a cherry Coke made by hand from syrup and carbonated water, mixed in a tall glass with ice, the ratio adjusted by whoever was working the fountain that day. The person working the drugstore counter was often called a soda jerk, a term that came from the jerking motion used to operate the soda fountain tap. This was not a prestigious title. It was usually a young person, a teenager or someone in their early 20s, working a job that required a different set of skills from the short-order cook, but a similar kind of daily repetition built into the hands. The milkshake was made in a metal cup using a specific machine, the blade spinning the ice cream, and milk into a thick consistency that required judgment about when it was right. The soda was mixed by feel and habit. The sandwich was assembled quickly and correctly because it had been assembled the same way several hundred times before. There was a particular quality to the mid-morning hour at a drugstore counter that differed from the diner. The diner at mid-morning had a specific population: workers on breaks, people between errands, the occasional retired man with nowhere particular to be. The drugstore counter at mid-morning had all of those, and also the woman who had just picked up a prescription and decided a cup of coffee was exactly what the next 20 minutes called for. The proximity of the pharmacy to the counter gave the space a slightly different social texture. People arrived there already in the middle of something, already handling the small practical business of a life, and the counter was a pause in that business rather than a destination in itself. What the drugstore counter shared with the diner was the fundamental quality that made both of them irreplaceable once they were gone. A place to sit down in the middle of the day, without a reservation, without a particular reason, and be brought something warm by someone who was going to take care of you for 20 minutes. The setting was different. The menu was shorter. The stools were fewer. But the offer was the same, and the offer was enough. It is worth pausing on something that seems unrelated to the food, but is not. When people went to the diner in the 1950s, they were dressed. Not formally, not in the way you dressed for a wedding, or a church supper, or a night at a restaurant with tablecloths, but dressed. The men wore trousers and a collared shirt. The women wore dresses or skirts with a blouse, or slacks if they were the kind of woman who wore slacks, which was becoming more common as the decade went on. Children were put into clean clothes before they were taken, anywhere public, including the diner. Getting dressed to go out was not a special act. It was just what you did when you left the house, and the diner was a place you left the house to go to. This sounds like a small thing, and it was a small thing, but it meant something about the relationship between the person and the public space they were entering. Dressing for the diner was not about impressing anyone at the counter. It was about showing up as a person who had prepared themselves for the day, who had considered their presentation before stepping out into the shared space of the street and the store and the lunch counter. The care was not extravagant. It was minimal. But minimal care applied consistently across a community of people produces a shared sense of occasion, however ordinary the occasion actually is. The diner itself dressed for the occasion, too, in its way. The counter was wiped clean every morning. The chrome was polished. The pie case glass was clear. The aprons on. The cook and the waitress were fresh at the start of the shift. These were not aesthetic choices made for the sake of atmosphere. They were functional choices made by people who took their work seriously and understood that a clean, well-maintained room was part of what they were offering. The room was prepared. The people in it were prepared. The transaction that took place between them carried the weight of that mutual preparation. Compare this to the experience of eating out now, which increasingly happens in whatever you happen to be wearing when the hunger arrives, which is often workout clothes or something approximating them. This is not a moral failure. It is a reflection of how casual eating out has become, which is itself a reflection of how thoroughly fast food and casual dining have normalized the idea that eating outside the home is no different from eating inside it. The restaurant has become an extension of the living room rather than an extension of public life. What was lost in that casualization was not formality for its own sake. It was the sense that going somewhere, even somewhere ordinary, was an act that deserved a small amount of preparation. The 15 minutes you spent getting ready before going to the diner were 15 minutes in which you crossed from the private world of the home into the public world of the street. The act of dressing marked that crossing. It said, "I am going out now," which also said something about where you were going and what you expected of it. The regulars at the lunch counter, in their pressed trousers and clean dresses, were not making a statement about themselves. They were participating in a shared convention about public life, one that said this space matters enough to present yourself to it. The space, in return, presented itself to them, clean and ordered and ready. The mutual preparation was a form of respect exchanged silently between people and place. It is the kind of thing that disappears so gradually you do not notice it going until one day you look around and realize it has been gone for years. Let's step outside for a moment. It is January now, somewhere in the middle of the country, and the temperature has been below freezing since before Christmas. The sidewalk is dry and cold, the kind of cold that settles into your coat within a block and reminds you it is there with every breath. You have been out on an errand, something necessary, that could not wait for warmer weather, and now you are 3 steps from the diner door. Before you even push it open, the smell reaches you, faint through the cold air, bacon and coffee finding their way out through the door frame and the brief gap above the threshold. You push through, and the warmth hits you at the same moment as the bell rings, and the smell wraps itself around you in full. Cold weather did something to the diner that mild weather did not. It made the room feel necessary rather than merely convenient. In summer, you went to the diner because it was there and you were hungry and the food was good. In January, you went to the diner because the alternative was standing in the cold and you were a person who deserved to be warm and fed. And the diner was the straightforward answer to that entirely reasonable need. The choice had a different quality to it, less casual, more deliberate, the kind of choice you made with full awareness of what you were choosing and why. The warmth inside the diner in winter was its own sensory experience. The heat came from the kitchen, from the griddle in the oven, and the bodies of the people working and eating in the room. And it was not the managed warmth of a thermostat-controlled modern space, but something more organic, generated by activity rather than by a system. When you sat down and took your coat off, the warmth found the parts of you the coat had not quite reached, the backs of your hands, the tips of your ears, the bridge of your nose. The coffee cup, when it arrived, was almost unreasonably welcome, both for the coffee inside it and for the heat that transferred through the ceramic into your cold fingers. The window in winter was a feature of the room in a way it was not in other seasons. Frost gathered at the edges of the glass in the early morning hours. As the day warmed and the room filled, condensation built on the inside surface and ran in slow streams toward the sill. Looking out through a slightly fogged diner window at a January street, while a hot plate sat in front of you and the coffee was fresh in the cup, was a specific kind of contentment that winter makes possible and that no other season replicates. You were in. The street was out. The contrast made the room feel generous in proportion to the cold it was keeping away from you. The diner in winter was also a social space in a heightened way. Cold weather drives people together, compresses the distances between them, fills the available warm rooms with more people than mild weather would send. The counter in January had a fuller, more various population than the counter in June. People who would have stayed at their desks through the lunch hour came out because they needed the warmth as much as the food. The man who usually brought his lunch found himself at the counter because heating something at home that morning had not seemed worth the effort. The diner absorbed all of them without adjustment, added a stool here, refilled the coffee pot there, and went about its business of feeding whoever walked through the door. There is a reason that the diner in winter is the image that lodges most permanently in the memory of people who ate at them. The contrast was sharp, and the comfort was real. The cold and the warmth, the empty street and the full counter, the bare hands and the hot cup. Simple oppositions that the diner resolved every January morning without drama, as though keeping people warm and fed in the middle of winter was the most ordinary thing in the world, which in a well-run diner it was. And so we come to the end of our Tuesday. The griddle is cooling now. The last cup has been poured. The waitress has wiped down the counter one final time, the cloth moving in slow circles across the laminate, picking up the small evidence of the day. A coffee ring, a few crumbs of pie crust, the chrome edge catching the late afternoon light one more time before the overhead fixtures are switched off and the room goes quiet. You have been here for a while now, longer than a lunch break, long enough to have sat through the morning rush and the noon crowd and the slow mid-afternoon and the Sunday quiet and the January warmth and all 30 chapters of a room that most of America has forgotten or never knew. Long enough to have earned one more cup of coffee before you go. The waitress would pour it without being asked. She always did. Here is what I want you to take with you when you leave. The 1950s diner was not perfect. Nothing from any era is perfect, and the honest telling of this story required acknowledging that. The counter that fed the factory worker and the hardware store owner with the same menu and the same coffee was also, in parts of this country, a counter that told certain Americans they were not welcome to sit at it. The ordinariness and the dignity that the lunch counter offered were things worth claiming for everyone, and the people who sat down and stayed in their seats to claim them were doing something that the room itself, at its best, already stood for. That contradiction is part of the history, and it belongs in the telling. But the things the diner did right, it did profoundly right. It fed people without making them feel anything other than fed. It held a room full of strangers together without requiring them to be anything other than strangers sharing a counter. It gave the day a shape and a pause and a warm cup at the center of it, and it did all of this for the price of a meal that anyone who needed it could afford. These are not small achievements. They are harder to build than they look. What pulls at us now, when we sit with these memories or encounter them for the first time through the telling of someone else, is not nostalgia for a decade. It is recognition of something true about what we need from the places we share. We need rooms that are honest, rooms that are accessible, rooms that hold people together without demanding anything from them beyond their presence. We need the bell above the door and the water glass and the name on the pin and the short menu that keeps its promises. We need someone who sees us walk in from the cold and responds with warmth that is not a performance. Those things do not belong to the 1950s. They belong to any era that chooses to build them. The decade is gone, and the diner with the chrome edge and the styrofoam coffee cups and the 15-cent pie is gone, and neither of those things is coming back. But the values that made the counter worth sitting at are not historical artifacts. They are available now to anyone building a room or running a kitchen or deciding how to treat the person who just walked through the door. So carry it with you if it means something to you. The weight of the cup, the sound of the stool, the particular warmth of a room that knew what it was and did it without apology every morning, every Tuesday, every January, for as long as the foot traffic came and the griddle stayed hot. Before you go, if this video gave you something, If it returned you to a place you had almost forgotten, or introduced you to a room you wish you could have sat in, go ahead and hit that like button. It costs you nothing, and it means a great deal. Subscribe if you have not already, because there are more rooms to walk into, more decades to sit with, more ordinary Tuesdays waiting to be remembered together. And leave me a comment. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me if you ever sat at a lunch counter, and which town, and what you ordered. Tell me if the memory lives in your hands, or your nose, or somewhere you cannot quite name. I read everyone, every single one, and every comment is its own kind of counter, its own small room where people who care about the same things find each other across the distance. It is 1955 somewhere in your memory. The coffee is still warm. The stool is still there. Come back next time. The diner will be open.